Good evening. I'm Mary Miller, the director of the Getty Research Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this night at the Getty Research Institute. We're here to honor three art historians, Barbara and Thomas Gaetkens, and Tim Barringer, our speaker. Barbara and Thomas have sent their regrets tonight, much as they wish that they could indeed be here. We also want to acknowledge the support of the Getty Research Institute Council that has made possible the Gaetkens Lecture Series. Through these lectures, we've been able to bring new and insightful art history to our council and beyond. We have heard from Diana Magaloni at LACMA, Zoe Struther at Columbia, Yukio Lippert from Harvard, and last year, Kelly Jones, also of Columbia. You may think that the secret ingredient of this list is the Columbia department, but I will just say that 3 of the 4 are Yale PhDs. I'll leave it up to you to do the Google searches. It makes me particularly proud to say both Getty and Yale in a single breath, as I do now to introduce Tim Barringer, Paul Mellon Professor and Chair of the History of Art at Yale. It might seem that one might want to describe Tim Barringer as a scholar of the art of Great Britain, as indeed he is. But when he speaks to us this evening on the topic, Why We Need Ruskin Now, I put a question mark on that, Tim. You will see that he is a scholar of Greater and Lesser Britain, with interests that truly transcend the globe. Perhaps this is because Tim's life and work started in Leeds, a place that was definitely not the center of the center, ever, and where the gritty detritus of modernity came home to roost in pollution of landscape, in manifesting the wretched conditions of labor and the human wreckage surrounding it, all in ways that the most august could not ignore, and that would indeed bleed into the picture from India to the Americas and back to the mothership. Tim Barringer writes about the Victorians, and we will hear something of this evening. His career started with the Pre-Raphaelites, and he's never given them up. But he also writes about Jamaica and India, connecting worlds that others might choose to see in isolation. He thinks through and from objects and through the curatorial process in exhibitions that range from those Pre-Raphaelites explicitly in the material culture that is at the heart of the exhibition he is currently organized with his Yale students, Victorian radicals, from the Pre-Raphaelites to the arts and crafts movement, on view at 8 US museums in sequence, not all at the same time, in the next year or so. And he has also been so engaged with exhibitions that have featured David Hockney, Malcolm Morley, and Yinka Shonibari. He's finishing a book, Broken Pastoral, Art and Music in Britain, Gothic Revival to Punk Rock, a co-edited collection on the viewing platform. The panorama from canvas to screen will appear in 2020. His forthcoming book, Global Landscape in an Age of Empire, is based on the Paul Mellon lectures given at the National Gallery, London, in 2019. I know Tim as a revered colleague and a beloved teacher. For years at Yale, he has packed the largest lecture hall suitable for showing images, 400 plus students hanging on his every word, but perhaps more to the point, focusing their eyes on every image. For them, Professor Barringer has been the way to discover that the humanities, history, literature, music, all depend on the visual image, centering humanistic inquiry through the lodestone of the 21st century. Why do we need Ruskin now? Tim, do tell us.
Well, thank you, Mary, for that very kind introduction. It's such a thrill and pleasure to be back at the Getty, where I spent a glorious year as a Getty scholar, 2004-2005. But it's even more of a pleasure to be introduced by Mary Miller, the person who gave me a job at Yale in 1998. And I'm very grateful to her. Mary, you already know, but I know better than you because we've worked together for 20 years, is a great scholar, a great teacher, but above all, a great mentor for young women and young men from every background who've come to Yale and whose careers and whose learning has benefited from Mary. So I just want to give a round of applause to Mary Miller. So let's turn to, there's no question mark, it's why we need Ruskin now. Though the profession did not exist in the English-speaking world when he was born 200 years ago in 1819, John Ruskin was an art historian. Indeed, he remains, I think, the most eloquent of all writers on art in the English language. His passionate rhetoric, marrying the authoritative cadence of the King James Bible with the vivid imagery of the Romantic poets, introduced generations of Victorian readers to modern and historical art and architecture. In this lecture, I want to think about how we, as art historians and museum curators today, might radicalize and renew our practice following Ruskin's example, freeing our imagination to engage with the widest of audiences and the most ambitious of themes. While we may benefit from his example, we don't have to agree with John Ruskin. In fact, he was usually wrong. He was wrong about gender, he was wrong about race, he was wrong about class. He endorses hierarchical ideas that belong in a past age and have no place in our contemporary world. Yet, disagree with him as we must, I want to argue tonight that we can find in his larger project inspiration for a dynamic, engaged, activist art historical practice. Because beyond his advocacy of J.M.W. Turner, the Pre-Raphaelites, of Gothic architecture and early Italian painting, Ruskin offered more. He offered powerful responses drawn from that thinking to the questions we face, the questions he faced in his time and the questions we face urgently today. The tense relationship between mankind and nature, I know the theme of the Getty Scholar Year. The problem of work in an industrial world, the conservation of historical buildings and collections, the relationship between past and present. And I want to introduce Ruskin with his own voice. Nobody can write better than he. I'm going to give you a long quote from The Nature of Gothic, which is a section of his 3-volume study of the stones of Venice. The quote I'm going to give you is a pioneering exercise in the global art history, which we now try and practice, but Ruskin offered a wonderful premonition of in his geophysical explanation of the distinctive character of Gothic architectural sculpture. Ruskin only wrote these words after many years of careful study and drawing. These are Ruskin's drawings on the screen, analyzing the cathedrals and churches of Northern Europe. It was an effort embodied in the exquisite wash drawing on the right of the portal and carved pinnacles at the Cathedral of Saint-Lô in Normandy, and the energetic soft ground etching of the same building on the left, which is seen in his book, The Seven Lamps of Architecture. And I was thrilled yesterday to see in an exhibition at the Huntington Library the original drawing for this etching on the left, which you can look at in their wonderful exhibition about the year 1919. Fortified with insights based on this close visual scrutiny, in The Nature of Gothic, Ruskin suddenly adopts a planetary perspective, one familiar to us in the digital age, the age of space travel and photographs from space, but breathtaking when you think about it from a 19th century critic. So he begins thus. The charts of the world, he says, which have been drawn up by modern science, have thrown into a narrow space the expression of a vast amount of knowledge. But I have never yet seen anyone pictorial enough to enable the spectator to imagine the kind of contrast in the physical character which exists between northern and southern countries. So if Google Image had existed, this would be the illustration for the next section. We know that gentians grow in the Alps and olives in the Apennines, but we cannot conceive for ourselves that variegated mosaic of the world's surface which a bird sees in migration, that difference between the district of the gentian and that of the olive, which the stork and the swallow see far off as they lean upon the sirocco wind. Let us for a moment try to raise ourselves even higher, above the level of their flight, and imagine the Mediterranean lying beneath us like an irregular lake, its ancient promontories sleeping in the sun. Here and there, an angry spot of thunder, a grey stain of storm moving upon the burning field. And here and there, a fixed wreath of white volcano smoke surrounded by its circle of ashes. But for the most part, a great peacefulness of light. Syria and Greece, Italy and Spain, laid like pieces of a golden pavement into the sea blue, chased, as we stoop nearer to them, with the bossy beaten work of mountain chains and glowing softly with terraced gardens and flowers heavy with frankincense, mixed among masses of laurel and orange and plumy palm that abate, with their grey-green shadows, the burning of the marble rocks, the ledges of porphyry sloping under lucent sand. And then let us pass further north until we see the orient colors change gradually into a vast belt of rainy green, where the pastures of Switzerland, the poplar valleys of France, and the dark forests of the Danube and the Carpathians stretch from the mouths of the Loire to those of the Volga, seen through clefts in grey swirls of rain cloud and flaky veils of the mist of the brooks spreading low among the pasture lands. And then, farther north still, we see the earth heave into mighty masses of leaden rock and heathy moor, bordering with a broad waste of gloomy purple that belt of field and wood, splintering into irregular and grisly islands among the northern seas, beaten by storm, chilled by ice drift, and tormented by furious pulses of contending tide, until the roots of the last forests fail from among the hill ravines, and the hunger of the north wind bites their peaks into barrenness, and at last the wall of ice, durable like iron, sets, death-like, its white teeth against us out of the polar twilight. And having once traversed in thought this gradation of the zoned iris of the earth in all its material vastness, let us go down nearer to it, submissively acknowledging the great laws by which this earth is ruled. And let us not condemn, but rejoice in the expression by man in the statues of the lands that gave him birth. Let us watch him with reverence as he sets side by side the burning gems and smooths soft sculptures and by the jasper pillars that are left to reflect a ceaseless sunshine and rise into the cloudless sky. But not with less reverence, let us stand by him when, with rough strength and hurried stroke, he smites an uncouth animation out of the rocks which he has torn from among the moss of the moorland, and heaves into the darkened air the iron buttress and rugged wall, instinct with a work of an imagination as wild and wayward as the northern seas, creations of ungainly shape and rigid limb, but full of wolfish life, fierce as the winds that beat, and changeful as the clouds that shade them. There is, I repeat, no degradation, no reproach in all this, but all dignity and honorableness. We should err grievously in refusing to recognize as an essential character of the existing architecture of the Gothic North this wildness of thought and roughness of work, this look of mountain brotherhood between the cathedral and the Alp, this magnificence of sturdy power put forth only the more energetically because the fine finger touch was chiseled away by the frosty wind and the eye dimmed by the moor mist or blinded by the hail. this outspeaking of the strong spirit of men who may not gather redundant fruitage from the earth nor bask in the dreamy benignity of sunshine, but must break forth rock for bread and cleave the forest for fire. They show, even in what they did for delight, some of the hard habits of the arm and heart that grew on them as they swung the axe or pressed the plough. I've let Ruskin speak at such length because the effects of his arguments are cumulative, relying on sound and poetry more than on logical proof. And while we may disagree with the specifics of Ruskin's account of the Gothic as northern, rough, and violent, I see the medievalists in the audience leaping up in horror, because, of course, there is a courtly and elegant Gothic style, and it's found south as well as north of the Alps. He's wrong, as usual. But we can admire the grandeur of this conceptual scheme, the ambition of the attempt to link architecture and culture through geology, climate, and environment with a particular place, and his eloquence in bringing an interpretative vision of north versus south so powerfully to life. And who can look at the front of Amiens, as you've been doing for the last 5 minutes, quite the same after reading the nature of Gothic? Well, why do I show Amiens and not Saint-Lô? Well, because in 1945, just the kind of historical catastrophe that Ruskin foretold saw the rugged Gothic of Saint-Lô destroyed during the invasion of Normandy, 1944, Its wounds are visible to this day, and you can see that there is the detail that Ruskin had lovingly drawn in the 1840s. We followed Ruskin's linkage between the Gothic and its northern origins, but my talk today will focus on the next move in his thinking. And it's this that renders him exceptional. Working outwards from his intensive observation of architecture and of the natural world, Ruskin was ultimately able, within our discipline of art history, to generate a critique of industrialization and a powerful denunciation of machine production and steam power, and the cruelty and unfairness of the capitalist dispensation under which he lived, and we live too. Applying the same close scrutiny to natural forms as to buildings, to trees, leaves, and rocks and mountains, rivers and clouds, he offered a prescient and despairing warning about industrialization's fatal environmental cost. Ruskin insisted that all of these things, these big questions, lay within the province of art history, a discipline of such intellectual and ethical heft, such moral urgency, that it could engage with figures like Charles Darwin and John Stuart Mill, the titans of Ruskin's own time. This discipline of ours, he insisted, can challenge orthodoxies, can shift the tastes of the multitude, can propose and even bring about change in the world. The questions then that he forces us to ask: how does art relate to history? How can we find a responsible relationship between mankind and nature? And ultimately, what is of value in this human life of ours? These questions are surely even more pressing for the world today than they were in Ruskin's lifetime, in a moment of precarity in world history. We used to call it precariousness, but students call it precarity now. So precarity. Precarity in world history, when political discourse has reached such a level of mendacity that world leaders wantonly lie and dissimulate, and a lawless class of super-rich people squander the world's resources. These are the considerations that preoccupy contemporary artists and activists, writers, critics, and theorists. But Ruskin tells us that it's art history that should address these questions. And at this point, I want to acknowledge that this lecture is the result of a collaboration with a group of Yale graduate students, led by Tara Contractor, Victoria Hepburn, and Judith Stapleton, who curated the exhibition Unto This Last at the Yale Centre for British Art, which closed last week, but will reopen at the Watts Gallery near London in March next year. And I want to thank Amy Myers, the former director of the Yale Center for British Art, who's here somewhere, for supporting students and wild faculty people like me in our crazy exhibition ideas. And when we say we want to publish a pamphlet, and we deliver a 340-page manuscript for publishing it in a beautiful hardcover Yale University Press book. So thank you, Amy. We argued in that show that Ruskin's importance extends beyond the sphere of the aesthetic, or even better, he extends the sphere of the aesthetic to include the great ethical questions that I've laid out. And we emphasized in the exhibition, too, that the fundamental tenet of Ruskin's beliefs was based ultimately on the idea of looking with your eyes and seeing. So a work such as J.M.W. Turner's great The Blue Rigi watercolor of 1842, now in Tate, Britain, was the kind of image that precipitated his belief that the faculty of sight held supreme authority within human life and discourse. This he expressed in one of his most remarkable epigrams. The greatest thing a human soul ever does in this world is to see something and tell what it saw in a plain way. Hundreds of people can talk for one who can think, but thousands can think for one who can see. To see clearly is poetry, prophecy, and religion, all in one. In Ruskin's thought, an intense visual scrutiny of nature and of art was a religious duty. To look at things physically could reveal higher truths. And this conviction reached back into the earliest days of his childhood. Although Ruskin's prose works runs to 39 large volumes, his contribution exceeds the sphere of the written world because drawing and painting in watercolors formed an essential core of his life's work. Like many children of wealthy parents in the Victorian era, Ruskin was taught drawing from an early age, learning the conventions of painting from various masters, including the watercolorist Anthony Van Dyck Copley Fielding, whose name is more interesting than his landscapes, as you can see. In 1884, Ruskin recalled the moment of revelation when he realized that the traditional language of art that his masters had taught him simply was inadequate. So he thinks back to the spring of 1841, when he's 12. I made, by accident, my first drawings of leafage in natural growth, a few ivy leaves round a stump in the hedge of the Norwood Road. This drawing is lost, but he remembers making it. I never imitated anybody anymore after that one sketch was made. Ruskin's own drawings served through his life as working documents, analytic experiments. They are elements in a larger project. They're not finished works of art. The larger project was to look at the world with an eye to understanding its deeper structures and resonances, its meanings, the structures underlying nature and society. As Tara Contractor persuasively argues in our exhibition catalogue, the art of sketching details, of natural details as well as architectural ones, leaves and brambles, pebbles and rocks, allowed Ruskin to explore the relation of the part to the whole, a fascination with synecdoche that ultimately led him to embrace a communitarian social theory. Every detail relates to the larger picture, the floriated ornament to the cathedral, the leaf to the tree. This amazing drawing of a leaf. Ruskin said, if you can draw a leaf, you can draw the world. And the individual human being relates in the same way to the greater social organism. In a watercolor, The Pass of Killikranky from 1857, Ruskin leads us through every crevice of the ancient metamorphic rock, the gneiss rock, revealing how it nurtures plants and how the water eddies around its base, slowly eroding the stone over centuries and millennia. The traditional subject of landscape, forests and distant mountains, is banished to the margins. Ruskin's interpretation of nature suggests to him an organic model of interaction, both in the natural world and in the human world, in society, which contrasted with the emphasis on competition and self-interest offered by political economy, or the emerging Darwinian ideas of natural selection and the survival of the fittest. His interest in minute details was in the service of a generous vision of nature and society, just as his tiny philanthropic gestures and ventures offered a sketch of a much larger utopian possibility. His drawings teach us to look closely at the parts, but to think about the organic whole. For all his childhood interest in the natural world, including this charming catalogue of his boyhood mineral collection written at the age of 14, he was a rather precocious brat, really, but nonetheless, it seemed, in fact, from his early writings that Ruskin would become a poet. He won the Newdigate Poetry Prize at Oxford in 1839. 3 years later, he painted this atmospheric watercolour of his college, Christ Church, whose chapel, serving as the town's cathedral, is itself an important Gothic building. And the college held an important collection of early Italian painting, then known as primitive, given to the college in 1834 by William Fox Strangways, including this Wounded Centaur by Filippino Lippi from the 1490s. This was a germ for Ruskin's serious interest in the revival of this value in this period, which was then, in the 1840s, considered to be merely of antiquarian interest. Indeed, the National Gallery bought this work by Lorenzo Monaco just to show how bad Italian art could be before Raphael fixed it in about 1500. That's the acquisition policy of the National Gallery in the 1840s. And this is a work we'll return to. But the origins of Ruskin's critical and historical project took root even earlier, in 1836-17, and already a student at Oxford, when he became outraged at press responses to the landscape paintings of J.M.W. Turner. Dim-witted art critics are another phenomenon linking the Victorian times with our own. And this pretentious young man embarked on the apparently self-contradictory experiment of demonstrating, and I quote, by thorough investigation of the actual facts that Turner is like nature. They all said, of course, that he wasn't. And he paints more of nature than any man who ever lived. So Ruskin was lucky in that he showed an interest in Turner and asked his father about this, and his father started to collect the works of Turner for young John, including this watercolor of Richmond, 1825-6, by Turner. His quest resulted in the publication of Modern Painters, Volume 1 in 1843. 4 more volumes would appear by the time this massive project reached its conclusion in 1860. And it's worth noting the importance of this book as a contribution to the theory of art. It challenged the authority of the cardinal document of British art theory, Sir Joshua Reynolds's Discourses, in which history painting stood at the apex of artistic production, portraiture and landscape being derided as inferior. And of course, this is also the great tradition of European academic art thinking right back to the Renaissance. But setting another precedent for us all, Ruskin rejected all inherited wisdom, decrying with great vehemence the lauded works of Claude, Poussin, and the Dutch masters. He called them Van something and Back something, couldn't even remember their names. He placed his faith in modern painters, an intriguing precedent for art history today, where the study of contemporary art is an engine for new thinking about the historical. And Ruskin argued that rather than inscribing the surface of nature into the world, Turner had found a visual means to express the underlying structures, processes, and meanings of nature, a kind of ecological art history in a way. The painter Turner, in Ruskin's account, gave, quote, an entire transcript of the whole system of nature, an intriguing precedent for later environmental thinking. Turner's art, as understood in modern painters, was an analytical project about the natural world, not merely a representational one. And Turner's life itself, for Ruskin, was an allegory of industrialization. Turner was a Cockney, born in London in 1775. And this watercolor by Turner, 1798, shows Covent Garden. The artist, wrote Ruskin rather irascibly, could endure ugliness which no one else of the same sensibility would have borne for an instant. Dead brick walls, blank square windows, old clothes, market womanly types of humanity, anything fishy and muddy like Billingsgate or Hungerford Market had great attraction for Turner. Black barges, patched sails, and every possible condition of fog. But a fateful encounter with the natural landscape of Yorkshire made an artist of him. At last, here's Ruskin again, fortune wills that the lad's true life shall begin, one summer evening. He finds himself sitting alone among the Yorkshire hills. For the first time, the silence of nature around him, her freedom sealed to him, her glory opened to him. Peace at last. No roll of cartwheel or mutter of sullen voices in the back shop, but curlew cry in space of heaven and welling up of bell-toned streamlet by its shadowy rock. Freedom at last. Dead wall, dark railing, fenced field, gated garden, all passed away like the dream of a prisoner. And behold, as far as foot can race or range, the moor and the clouds, loveliness at last. It is here among these deserted vales, not among men, those pale, poverty-stricken, cruel faces, the multitudinous, marred humanity of the city, are not the only things that God has made. Here is something he has made which no one has marred, pride of purple rocks, river pools of blue, and tender wilderness of glittering trees and misty lights of evening on immeasurable hills. It's as if in seeing Yorkshire, Turner, looked at through Ruskin's Wordsworthian vision, was able to wash away modernity's carbon stain, to repair the damage done to nature and society by the machine, by poverty, by disease, by the modern city. Turner's life in Ruskin's reading was a kind of parable in which modern despoliation was erased by a renewed embrace of nature. Now, Turner's own attitude to technology and modernity, seen in later works such as Rain, Steam, and Speed of 1844, was much more complex and ambivalent than Ruskin wants to allow. The locomotive hurtling across the Maidenhead Viaduct on Brunel's Great Western Railway at 29 miles per hour. There it is. It's like faster than it goes now, actually. It appears both thrilling and demonic, an emblem of progress as well as destruction. The coal fire heating its boiler mysteriously appears somehow on the front of the train, manifested for the beholder in a shock of white and red brushwork. While he perpetuated the nature worship of the Lakes poets, Ruskin was also involved in the latest thinking in geology and climatology. Take his response to Turner's watercolor Bolton Abbey of 1825, which Ruskin himself possessed. Though Ruskin accepts that Turner has exaggerated the height of this scree by the river, and you can see it's actually very much smaller than Turner shows it to be, and I know that because I was married in that bit there, so it's well known to me. The critic himself made an engraving of this section of Turner's watercolor. So this is Ruskin's engraving of this section of Turner's watercolor. And he emphasizes the striations of the shale and provides a detailed geological analysis, drawing on the work of the professor of geology at Oxford, John Phillips. And by comparing Turner's drawings of rocks, which he names as the Yoredale Shales, with the geologist's description, noting features such as the long, straight joints dividing the rock into rhomboidal prisms, Ruskin is triumphantly able to demonstrate Turner's underlying truth, his underlying understanding of the structures of nature. And geology was central to Ruskin's advice to budding amateur artists in The Elements of Drawing, his textbook written in 1859, How to Draw. Ruskin insisted that we should all draw. We should draw slowly and carefully. A stone, when examined, he intoned, will be found to be a mountain in miniature. Go out into your garden or into the road and pick up the first round or oval stone you can find, not very white, not very dark. If you can draw that stone, you can draw anything. he dedicates 10 densely written pages of instruction to the business of copying a pebble. And I made my students do it in class, and it's not as easy as you would think, I can tell you. Ruskin himself was the master of the representation of rocks, as in this superb study, A Fragment of the Alps, 1854-6, purchased by Charles Eliot Norton for the study of the use of the students at Harvard, where it still is. Paintings of rocks, Ruskin argued, should document not only their present condition, but also the deep geological past. And as Judith Stapleton notes in our catalogue, the banding of iron on this boulder, this alpine boulder here, expresses both the transformation of molten rock at the time of its creation and, with the oxidizing of the iron into rust in our own present time, the continuing vitality of geologic matter. In graver moments, Ruskin portended the end of the world, a judgment day, which he correctly saw foretold in the arc of geological time. This form of intensive looking was the origin of a distinctively Ruskinian brand of painting, a new realism which emerged in the 1850s. A powerful exhortation at the end of Modern Painters I was addressed specifically to young artists, lads like these who were studying at the Royal Academy schools at the time. There was no point, Ruskin said, in trying to get to Turner's position of mastery just by imitating him. Young artists, I quote, have no business to ape the execution of masters. Their duty is to be humble and earnest in following the footsteps of nature and tracing the finger of God. They should go to nature in all singleness of heart and walk with her laboriously and trustingly, having no other thoughts but how best to penetrate her meaning, and remembering her instruction, rejecting nothing, selecting nothing, and scorning nothing, rejoicing always in the truth. This passage was instrumental in persuading that group of young students that we've just been looking at the Royal Academy schools, John Everett Millais, Dante Gabriel Rossetti with the long hair, William Holman Hunt, and their friends, to renounce traditional academic technique and to form what they called the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood in 1848. Now, why Pre-Raphaelite? Well, like Ruskin, these students admired what they believed to be the truth and honesty of those very 15th century works which had been purchased by the National Gallery to show how bad art was before Raphael. And if you want to really annoy your professor, find the thing that he says is useless and tell him it's fantastic. It happens all the time. And here we are, the the Lorenzo Monaco San Benedetto altarpiece of 1407-8, and of course, Jan van Eyck's Arnolfini portrait of 1434, both purchased in the mid-1840s by the National Gallery. Millais' Isabella of 1849 paraphrased the Lorenzo Monaco. Look at those figures, those blocks of pink and yellow, even replicating aspects of the composition, but he represented faces with an uncanny precision and clarity which surely he had learned from the new technology of the daguerreotype photograph, barely a decade old. The radical juxtaposition of new and old in these works was too much for the critics of the daily papers, and there was a furore. Ruskin was absolutely angered by the disapprobation directed against works in which, of course, he saw fingerprints of his own teachings. And he wrote to the Times about this painting, Convent Thoughts by Charles Alston Collins. Dear Sir, I have no particular respect for Mr. Collins's Lady in White because her sympathies are divided between some goldfish and a tadpole. But I happen to have a special acquaintance with the water plant Alisma plantago. There it is. Among which said goldfish are swimming. And as I never saw it so thoroughly or so well drawn, I must take leave to remonstrate with you when you say that these men sacrifice truth as well as feeling to eccentricity. For as a mere botanical study of the water lily and alisma, as well as the common lily and several other garden flowers, this picture would be invaluable to me, and I heartily wish it were mine. Well, that's cool. But imagine how they felt when they read this, because Ruskin continued with words of great significance for the future of British and American art. As far as I can judge of their aim, for as I said, I do not know the men themselves, the Pre-Raphaelites intend to surrender no advantage which the knowledge or inventions of the present time can afford to their art, and I think he's referring to photography. They intend to return to the early days in this one point only, that they will draw either what they see or what they suppose might have been the actual facts of the scene they desire to represent, irrespective of any conventional rules of picture-making, which is, of course, exactly what they're taught at the Royal Academy. And they have chosen their unfortunate, though not inaccurate, name because artists did this before Raphael's time and after Raphael's time did not this, but sought to paint fair pictures rather than represent stern facts, of which the consequence has been that from Raphael's time to this, historical art has been in acknowledged decadence. Take that, Titian, Rembrandt, and all the others. Decadent. And with this magisterial endorsement, Ruskin transformed Pre-Raphaelitism from a revivalist to a realist movement. William Holman Hunt's Our English Coasts, exhibited the following year, 1852, represents perhaps the most intense manifestation of this Ruskinian creed. Even the light shining through the ears of the sheep, showing the veins, can clearly be seen. Ruskin said, "Bring a magnifying glass when you come to the exhibition, you'll need it." And taking up a leadership role as now the critic and the patron in relation to this new group, in 1853, he commissioned John Everett Millais to paint a portrait of him standing upon a lovely piece of worn rock with foaming water and weeds and moss and a noble overhanging bank of dark crag. As Millais' painstaking work on the painting continued, he said he painted about 1 shilling a day, that's the size of a quarter. So it took him 2 years to finish this thing. Ruskin began a drawing in pen himself of the rocks opposite. Millais and his brother were less enthusiastic about painting from life in Scotland because of the midges, the terrifying Scottish mosquitoes, and they developed a way of covering their heads with old sheets, taking refuge in this improvised protective outfit. Awful protection against midges, says Millais. And let me confirm, having found the rock myself, that the midges are still there, and they are still as ferocious as they ever were. At the very moment that the portrait was begun in 1853, Ruskin published the second volume of The Stones of Venice, the one I read from at the beginning, in which art historical analysis metamorphosed into social critique. He'd written crucial portions of this text as London was in thrall to the spectacle of Joseph Paxton's Crystal Palace in Hyde Park, the site of the great exhibition of the industry of all nations in 1851. The exhibition was a hymn to the machine, to the commodity, to global trade as a panacea. It formed a ceremonial high altar of capitalism and empire. Ruskin turned his back on this in disgust, gazing instead with unparalleled intensity at the details of late medieval Venice. He made his own illustrations to the volume, and as Victoria Hepburn reveals in our catalogue, used a wide range of print techniques, each one selected to reflect the particular character of the architecture described by the plate. So an archivolt in the Duomo of Murano, for example, you emphasize the chromatic range of Venetian stone through hand coloring. You see really clearly the hand coloring here over 2 colors of lithography, incredibly complicated and very beautiful print. All over Britain, architects were thrilled by these plates and revived with a revived interest in polychrome decoration in churches and public buildings. Here is the decoration of John Hungerford Pollen's Catholic University Church in Dublin, 1856, clearly referring to Ruskin's plates of 1853. But Ruskin was less happy when people started building railway stations in the Venetian style. And he wrote in despair, "I have had an indirect influence on every cheap villa builder between Denmark Hill and Bromley, and there is scarcely a public house near the Crystal Palace but sells its gin and bitters under a pseudo-Venetian capital copied from the Madonna of Health or of Miracles." So he wasn't so happy with that. The time-ravaged masonry of Venice offered Ruskin's receptive eye and mind a new understanding of social and economic organization. He saw in the traces of the physical traces of the late medieval laborer's hand, as in this superb drawing of St. Mark's, an alternative set of possibilities for the nature of work itself. We just go in closer and look at the way that Ruskin spends hours copying the exact movements of the Gothic sculptor's hands. On this basis, rather than offering an architectural history, a mere chronicle of changing styles, The Stones of Venice opens with an astonishing declaration, one perhaps suggested by Ruskin's love of Turner's great Venetian paintings of the 1830s. Since first the dominion of men was asserted over the ocean, 3 thrones of mark beyond all others have been set up upon its sands, the thrones of Tyre, Venice, and England. Of the first, ancient Tyre, only the memory remains. Of the second, that's Venice, the ruin. And the third, England, which inherits their greatness, if it forgets their example, may be led through prouder eminence to less pitied destruction. Thus announced, Ruskin's project is revealed as both a critical history of the rise and fall, what Ruskin thought was the fall of Venetian architecture, by a process of mainly implicit historical comparison, though, he also offers a fundamental critique of British society under modern capitalism, a critique that resonates more powerfully than ever today. Ruskin's aim, with Turner's Venice surely in his mind, was, and I quote, "to record as far as I may the warning which seems to me to be uttered by every one of the fast-gaining waves that beat like passing bells against the stones of Venice." A determining link is asserted between morality and architecture, and more broadly between the quality of social life people live and the quality of aesthetic production from their society. Ruskin said he had no other aim than to show that the Gothic architecture of Venice had arisen out of and indicated in all its features a state of national faith, domestic virtue, and that its Renaissance architecture had arisen out of and in all its features indicated a state of national infidelity and domestic corruption. The sinister implications for modern Britain and for the rest of the world were plain. We get the architecture we deserve. So for the Victorians, there's what Ruskin called a giant cucumber shed, the Crystal Palace, or the fake vulgarity of the mock Gothic Palace of Westminster. And what, I wonder, do we get? Well, I say no more. At the core of Ruskin's text lay a novel and penetrating account of labor itself, the way human beings spend the bulk of their lives, where the sculpture of the late medieval and the Gothic is a reified form of healthy social relations, a vibrant culture. The art and architecture of the Greeks, the Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Romans, in fact, relied, Ruskin said, on a machine-like slavery. Slavery, it was servile because the workman must produce perfection instead of the Gothic imperfection. Now, the use of the term slave in this context derives from the Chartist movement. This is a Chartist poster of 1848, and you'll see, "We are the slaves of capital. We demand protection for our labor." This is the great working class movement of 1848. Yet, perhaps the most shocking aspect of Ruskin's entire oeuvre is that, as acutely sympathetic as he was to wage slavery in the English factory, he had no such concern for the enslaved men and women of the American South. After all, the British Empire had ended slavery in 1838, but when he was writing, there was still slavery. And during the Civil War, he would support the Confederacy, horrifying his devoted American followers such as Charles Eliot Norton of Harvard, and still continuing to present an insuperable problem for his readers today. Ruskin's contrast between free Gothic and enslaved classical worlds rebounds on the Victorian era with ferocity. Ruskin warns that the modern English mind with its demand for complete perfection, that's the machine aesthetic of 1851, shares much with the slave culture of Egypt and Greece. Indeed, this text on Gothic Venice suddenly abandons any kind of historical language and adopts a mode of direct address to the middle-class Victorian consumer. You can imagine someone sitting at home reading this nice book about Venice, and suddenly Ruskin says, look around this English room of yours and examine its accurate mouldings and perfect polishings, unerring adjustments of the seasoned wood and tempered steel of which you are so proud. In these, he says, you can find a sign of slavery in our England, because the workers who made it in factories have become leather thongs to yoke machinery with, sent like fuel to feed the factory smoke. The strength of them is given daily to be wasted into the fineness of a web. This modern domestic environment with its plush, precision manufactured furnishings, Ruskin says, must be subjected to the same kind of analysis as Venetian architecture. They should be read rightly. And in the process of reading material evidence, we reach some terrifying conclusions. Men were not intended to work with the accuracy of tools. If you will have precision out of them and make their fingers measure degrees like cogwheels, you will unhumanize them. Ruskin saw unhumanized labor, dehumanized labor, at first hand in industrial cities. Unlike most artists, such as William Wilde, who were happy to leave the city as a distant prospect, Ruskin actually entered the Victorian city of Sheffield, a town he came to know well, where he met working men and focused his philanthropic endeavors. Sheffield products such as knives, saws, and cast iron fireplaces, these famous fireplaces made in Sheffield, here are the saw blades, were a great success at the Crystal Palace exhibition of 1851. They displayed precisely that geometric precision to which Ruskin referred. Under the conditions of industrial capitalism, however, creativity was gone from the worker. It was transferred onto the designer, if it existed at all. For an alternative model, of course, Ruskin turned back to the Gothic masons of Venice, who left the mark of their individual hand in these, which is lovingly captured in these drawings. And he even found a modern avatar for the Gothic laborer. This man, one of the two O'Shea brothers of Ireland, who were brought over from carving tombstones in Dublin to carve windows on the new museum at Oxford, which Ruskin was an advisor for, the Oxford Museum, University Museum. And indeed, at Yale, you can find the influence of John Ruskin vividly apparent in Street Hall. Here's the design with the Ruskinian windows and with wonderful hand-carved capitals here. I say this with great melancholy because that used to be my office before we got moved out into a new building. But we had a Ruskinian moment in Street Hall, the old art history department. And the Gothic took on, for Ruskin, the highest ethical significance. It is the sign, he says, of the life and liberty of every workman who struck the stone, a freedom of thought such as no laws, no charters, no charities can secure, but which it must be the first aim of all Europe at this day to reclaim for her children. He obviously wasn't a believer in Brexit, and nor am I. But with these words, Ruskin rejected liberal reforms. No good having the 10 Hours Act, the Poor Law Amendment Act, no more. Another person writing in London at the same time wrote something very similar, and his name was Karl Marx. A transformation in the relationship between worker and product was needed in order to save society. But Ruskin argued this in favor, on the basis of natural beauty as much as social utility. Marx fused the Hegelian dialectic with Parisian radical politics. Ruskin came to the same solutions through looking closely at nature and historical sculpture. Their methodologies, their intellectual heritage, their political instincts were entirely at odds, but both men identified the scene of labor as the key locus for revolutionary change, and both saw Victorian capitalism as culpable in wasting human souls. At the core of Ruskin's work, and this is really where I'll end, is a credo laid out most vividly and simply in the book from which we took our exhibition title, Unto This Last, published in 1860 to 62. Published indeed to the consternation of Victorian opinion, including the editor of the magazine, William Makepeace Thackeray, the author of Vanity Fair, published these essays in Cornhill magazine and caused an absolute uproar. The title derives from the parable of the workers in the vineyard in the Gospel according to St. Matthew, in which the labor market is used as a metaphor for the kingdom of heaven, and widely accepted economic ideas are refuted. The laborers who come only late in the day are given an equal wage to those who have toiled for many hours. Those who complain are told, "Take that thine is and go thy way. I will give unto this last, even as unto thee." This is, of course, a metaphor for Christ treating everyone equally in this life and the next. Ruskin argues for fixed wages, removing supply and demand as a market mechanism, for a communitarian approach in which everyone is offered a decent livelihood and workers contribute to society because they value their occupation rather than to maximize profits. He saw the message of Christianity as one of equality, and addressing the wealthy, insisted that the poor and the deprived, the last in line, would be treated unto this last equally as they were by Christ. The climax of Ruskin's work, then, can be found in the great peroration with which he concludes these essays. It offers what he calls one great fact clearly stated. There is no wealth but life. Life, including all its powers of love, of joy, and of admiration. This simple statement contradicts the entire edifice of economic thinking, in which wealth is calculated in monetary terms as capital. With it, Ruskin fundamentally challenges the direction that Western society has taken since his time. He deliberately adopted the language of political economy, now known as economics, in order to overturn its central tenet. In our own late capitalist age of cruel and unapologetic materialism, of grotesque inequality between rich and poor, visible on the streets of London and Los Angeles, such sentiments may seem quaint. But Ruskin's invocation of great facts has never been needed more than it is today. Now, Ruskin never got involved in politics. He didn't believe in democracy and he didn't vote. But his writings had profound political importance far beyond his own limited political vision. Widely disseminated and translated, they resonated with radical thinking for later generations. And as he moved out of the public eye in the 1880s, many other people started to read his work. And his aesthetic writings certainly were taken up in the United States, Russia, Japan, and elsewhere. There were Ruskin societies, Ruskin libraries, Ruskin tea rooms. But it was Ruskin's radical social theory, derived from art history, linking artistic production to the reform of labor, that achieved the greatest global impact. In Britain, the social critique embedded in the nature of Gothic inspired William Morris and the founders of the British Independent Labour Party. When they were polled as to what their greatest influence was, everyone expected it to be Karl Marx, and it was John Ruskin's Unto This Last, the #1 book of all the founders of the British Labour Party in 1893. Walter Crane envisaged a Ruskinian triumph of labour with a return to Renaissance costume, heralding a socialist rebirth of the nation. In Japan, groups of intellectuals formed to celebrate craft traditions and turn against machine-made objects. But the most important influence of John Ruskin, by far, occurred when, amid the dust of a station in Durban, South Africa, a copy of Unto This Last was handed to a dapper young lawyer from another part of the British Empire, Mohandas K. Gandhi. Upon reading this book, he recalled, I determined to change my life in accordance with its ideals. In 1908, he translated Unto This Last into Gujarati, creating a paraphrase called Sarvodaya, the uplift of all, the term he applied to describe his own unique form of Indian socialism. Ruskin himself, of course, supported British imperialism, but others could draw different conclusions from his work where he himself failed. Gandhi's words undermined the fundamental logics and structures of the British Empire, because for him, industrialization marked not progress, but regression. And Gandhi turned from a prosperous lawyer to a hand spinner, a maker of woven fabrics, celebrating the lowly, the traditional, and the ecologically sustainable functioning of the village, of farm laborers and craftsmen. Here is a book that we included in our exhibition, which is actually bound in khadi, the cloth that he created through this form of hand spinning and weaving. And at a time when the super capitalists of the British Empire and American robber barons bestrode the planet, as of course they still do today, Gandhi, following Ruskin, proposed that life itself, enhanced by human interaction and creative, generative labor, constituted the only true capital. Now, while the conclusions were more starkly drawn by Gandhi than ever by Ruskin, there's a direct line from Ruskin's art historical endeavors to the end of the British Empire precipitated by Gandhi. And Ruskin was himself also a teacher of men and women. In the 1850s, he taught at the Working Men's College, and in Sheffield, he set up this marvelous museum for the working men. He said, I want to make it into a working man's Bodleian library filled with beautiful objects, and we imitated it somewhat as best we could in our exhibition at Yale with the object types, mineral samples, feathers, ceramics, a Gothic Bible, plaster casts of the cathedral at Amiens. He bought a cottage at Walkley, a little tiny cottage, and filled it with these magical things. And doubtless Ruskin did aim to sublimate working-class discontent through the perception of beautiful objects. And this is how he was perceived by an unkind cartoon in the pages of Fun magazine, Ruskin as a sort of Anglican priest scattering petals on the ground against a seething backdrop of industrial violence. But the cartoon's depiction of the filthy black sky brings me to the last point I want to make. Because Ruskin noticed what most visitors to Manchester and London would notice, the thick smog that built up in the winters. But he intuited what modern climate science has begun to call the Anthropocene, the geological era in which mankind has irrevocably shaped the future of the planet through carbon emissions and other actions. And as Ruskin aged, he became morbidly aware of changes in the air, changes that he described in landscape that interwove empirical observation with prophetic commentary. In 1884, he gave 2 lectures on the storm cloud of the 19th century, the culmination of 5 decades of looking closely at the sky, achieved through sketching and watching. He was fervently interested in meteorology, but his observations moved beyond the empirical, entering a symbolic, moral, and even religious vein. He said he had identified the plague wind of the 8th decade of years in the 19th century. Reviewing notes made in 1875 and onwards, he recalled a cloud that looked, quote, as if it were made of poisonous smoke. Very possibly it may be, but there are 200 furnace chimneys in a square mile, in a square of 2 miles on every side of me. But smoke would not blow to and fro in that wild way. It looks to me as if it were made of dead men's souls. Ruskin intuited the connection between industrial pollution, ill health, and climate change. He was decried as mad in his own time. Someone said it was like being screamed at by a mad governess reading Ruskin. But he understood what he called the Manchester devil's darkness, arguing that only by paths of rectitude and piety once regained can the promise of the old time be found once again. He states a truth so obvious now to everyone except the government of this country that mankind must return to ecological balance or face certain annihilation. And he noticed that in 1884. So to conclude, Ruskin's personal and intellectual imperfections are as visible as those of a tortured Gothic sculpture, compared to the sleek, machine-made product. But his approach to the burning issues of our own day, environmental preservation, respect for the natural world, the value of individual lives in the face of global systems, the essential role of individual creativity, these demand our attention. We still live in a world where the animation of multitudes is sent to feed the factory smoke. That multitude may be living thousands of miles away from us, but their condition is as desperate as in the 19th century. So why do we need Ruskin now? Ruskin emphasized the integration of the aesthetic, the socio-political, the ecological, and the pedagogical. All of these are potentially elements of art historical practice today. His mode of interconnected communal thinking offers a corrective intersectional model of, in an age of academic over-specialization. He was a scientist, he was an artist, he was a historian. And Ruskin's perception of the storm cloud of the 19th century predicted, after all, with uncannily accuracy, the apocalyptic potential of global warming. It was his art historical eye, trained by drawing from nature and looking at architecture, that revealed to him those higher truths, the fires and floods on a biblical scale, the monuments to Mammon all around us today, only heighten the importance of his warnings, especially the rising tides and Venice, just as he predicted in 1853, and the flames fanned by global warming across Australia to the walls of this very building. Above all, though, Ruskin's greatest gift was the use of language, rich and eloquent, to reach beyond the museum, beyond the academy, to the widest readership, to persuade a wide readership of the inalienable value of the fragile and the irreplaceable in the natural environment and the built environment. All of these under existential threat. 200 years after his birth, we have rarely stood in greater need of Ruskin's quiet yet revolutionary creed, "There is no wealth but life." Thank you.
Tim has said to me that he would take a few questions. I think he's taking a short, he's getting back up. No rest for the weary. I wondered if we could start off, if I could just put you on the spot of, if we really talk a lot about Ruskin, is Ruskin going to get canceled? Because in the modern terminology, where one's missteps in one arena force you to be canceled in another. So he may be very right about so many things, but how do you deal with all the things where he was so wrong?
Yes, that's a great question. Thank you, Mary. And it was a question that we really had to think about when we thought about doing this exhibition, because, can you find anything of merit in someone who offered the choice of supporting slavery or not supporting slavery in 1861, made the wrong choice? And, is that just makes him impossible to cancel, just gone? And, you could look into his sex life and find he didn't have one, and some people have a problem with that. So I think the answer is we felt that we acknowledge right at the beginning, and in the introductory text panel of the exhibition, at the front of the book, first paragraph of my talk, that we disagree with Ruskin, that he made the wrong choices, but that there's a sort of structural possibility in his way of thinking. It's just like Ruskin believed in the British Empire, but Gandhi read Ruskin and destroyed the British Empire, if you want to put it crudely. So his thinking actually has the potential to be read against the grain of his own political opinions, his own limitations, and to offer the possibility for quite different things to be done. And of course, you know, we stand to be accused, and I do, of promoting somebody who holds repulsive views. You know, this is a problem with almost all figures in the 19th century. In fact, there's very few that one could honestly say that I endorse everything that Edouard Manet or Richard Wagner or, you know, Napoleon or whoever I mean, so in a way, it's a sort of impossible search for the person of perfect rectitude by our own standards. But Ruskin was particularly misguided in some areas where he didn't need to be, where other people didn't share that view. And we just have to acknowledge that. And I think, you know, the potential is there in Ruskin's writing to critique Ruskin, which is a wonderful thing about his generosity of argument.
Any chance that this amazing exhibition will travel to the United States, maybe here, to the Getty?
Well, it was not really, I fear not really. I mean, it would be lovely to think of doing a Ruskin show at the Getty. The point of this particular exhibition was to find out what there is at Yale University in its own holdings. So the three students who worked on it spent a year going through all the archives, the Beinecke Rare Book Library, which had lots of wonderful boxes marked things like miscellaneous, one of which contained the original manuscript of The Storm Cloud of the 19th century, which had been believed to be lost since 1909. So it was those kinds of discoveries. Then we started to assemble objects which would allow us to show Ruskin's view of the world. So we went down to the Peabody Museum of Natural History, which has a great geological collection, and said, have you got any uncut diamonds? And how about some fluorspar? And we'd like some. And we assembled a set of 20 of Ruskin's, what he thought were the most important minerals, and just put them in the gallery. They were fantastic. So it was very much a sort of Yale-centered thing. But I think an exhibition about Ruskin, which isn't an art exhibition. I mean, that was what we did. Previously, they'd normally been Turner, Ruskin, and the Pre-Raphaelites. You know, beautiful painting, marvelous, his drawings. But actually, it's the other stuff. It's the manuscripts, it's the sketches, it's the objects. It's things like the corrected proofs tell you an awful lot about Ruskin. What did he not like about the way an engraver had handled one of his, his drawings and turned it into a print? And we had a lot of that sort of stuff, which is, it's not the kind of messy material that an art gallery normally wants to show. And that was the excitement of this particular exhibition. But if the Getty were to want a large Ruskin show, I could make my calendar free at any moment. So.
Tim, I just want to say, I don't know if you've been following all the news from the Getty, but Pacific Standard Time 3 will be art and science. And so I'm looking at Joan Weinstein as I say that, but perhaps there's a conversation to be had.
Great.
Another question. Yes.
Hi, I just wanted to let you all know, in case you didn't know, that there's going to be a major conference on Ruskin at the Huntington Library, which Dr. Behringer has mentioned a little earlier. It's going to begin on Friday morning at the Huntington. We have about 12 major Ruskin scholars from around the world coming to speak about Ruskin and his legacy, which will then connect to Ruskin's influence on Southern California. So it's a conference that begins on Friday in the morning, about 9, I think, in the morning. Goes all the way on Friday, goes all the way on Saturday. If any of you are interested in taking advantage of that, there are a number of us who are going to be participating in that conference here tonight, and we'd be glad to tell you more about it.
Thank you. Great.
Question here.
Can you maybe tell us what your first impressions were yourself as a scholar when you discovered Ruskin as to where you are today?
That's a great question. Well, in 1984, he began. You know, sounds like it's going to be a long answer. It's not. There was a show. I was an undergraduate. I was indeed. I was an undergraduate at Cambridge, and there was an exhibition of the Pre-Raphaelites at Tate Britain. And a whole generation of us who could have had, you know, mediocre careers in real estate. Instead of that, we went to this show, and we all became art historians, and we all became historians of the Pre-Raphaelites, because they put the work on the wall, and they didn't say anything about it. They're just like, here it is, you know. and there was no interpretation, but it was a brilliant collection of art. And being a 19-year-old at the time, reading a lot of Victorian novels, I was a history undergraduate, not even an art historian. It was that show that changed my path. And for my senior essay, I said to the history faculty, can I write about John Ruskin? And they were like, no. So I said, can I write about Victorian and John Ruskin and concepts of labor in Victorian discourse? And they're like, yes, that's fine. So you've just heard my senior essay, essentially. I've been peddling this for 35 years. But that was the moment when I thought, you know, there's more to be said about the relationship between those paintings, this conceptual framework, and our contemporary time. And, you know, a lot of the artists who were my generation, I'm exactly the same age as Damien Hirst and Rachel White Reid, we all were sort of coming out of this, you know, what do you do after modernism? What do you do after Thatcherism? What do you do, how do you respond to this world with a miners' strike going on and the place falling to pieces? And, you know, you can't really believe in the story the Museum of Modern Art is trying to tell us anymore because it doesn't seem to hang together. So all of those things made Ruskin seem relevant in a way that he probably didn't seem relevant in 1974 or 1934. You know, so I think it was that moment. So there's your answer. If you wish to psychoanalyze what I've just said, please buy me a drink afterwards. So, yeah.
Well, I have to say, I think that's a perfect note to wrap up this evening. That little biographical bit and a gesture to the past and the future. Tim, thank you for this remarkable evening.